So let's take a look at some of the things she did. One of the things she did was this.
Is there anything that...
So she's talking about anything that they could talk about. Now, this is a classic kind of container gesture. It's basically saying there's a set of abstract ideas, topics of conversations topics that she could have a conversation with the client over. And really she's saying she's open to anything. It's this big container gesture. And she's essentially indicating her openness to talking about almost anything by the size of the gesture. So the property of this opening is really tied to her openness to talk about anything. But notice what she does next, the very next gesture.
Decides what he wants.
So she throws the husband out of the conversation because she doesn't really want to talk to the client about what the husband wants. He really wants to talk about what what's bothering the client. And so really what's going on here is this gesture is connected to the previous gesture. She's actually removing the husband from any topics they could talk about. So we can talk about anything except what the husband wants. So the husband is essentially thrown out of the set, thrown out of the container. And so what we're getting here now is a sequence of gestures. And I'll talk more about this notion of a sequence of gesture in a few minutes, but it's the underlying metaphor is staying the same. It's this notion of a set, and set have elements, and you can take things out of a set, and as we'll see, you can do other things to a set. Now, this whole notion of a metaphor is really rampant in the dialogue, in dialogue. So you can look at the work by Grady, 1997, I believe it's Grady's PhD thesis. And he sort of documented all the metaphors that you can find in language. And many of these metaphors are very connected to gestures that you can, I think in this talk, all these ones I just bolded are actually coming up in this talk. That you can actually see that people are conveying these metaphors through their gestures in various kinds of ways. And what you saw before is a combination too, because you're going to see that she creates the set, but the way she created the set is kind of interesting. So I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me get to that in a moment. So if we were going to formally model this in the computer, that's to say we're not going to use machine learning, we're going to formally model this in the computer. You might think that there's this abstract mental space of concepts, sets of concepts like topics of conversation. You can depict the property of the concept. You can take a property of the set in the sense that it's large. It's a large number of things. You can talk about anything. And you can also take actions on these concepts. So we can sort of take things out of the set. We can remove the husband from the set. And so this abstract mental space of sets, and sets have elements in them, they have cardinality, and you can put things into sets and take things out of sets, all have physical manifestation in terms of things like objects, containers. The properties of a container can be depicted by some physical gestures showing the size, and these notions of taking something out of the set can be depicted by a motion of the hand. And so really there's the abstract level, and then there's the grounded physical space, which tells you, essentially how the gesture is manifested. And so you can actually, come up with a formalism of the relationship between this notion of a set. It's physically realized as a container, a gesture. It contains anything, so it's a big container. And there's particular elements in that set, like what the husband wants, wishes the wife would do, and that is inside the set, but it can be removed from the set. And so that basically becomes those two gestures we just saw. And so that's essentially this kind of space
Decides what he wants.
that we see there. And we can kind of think about it, well, that's just a set. But when you think about it, well, sets can actually express lots of different things, right? And this is an exercise I did for some paper where I just sort of laid out, well, what's a set? What, at the abstract level, what's a set? What are all the properties of a set? And what are all the actions I can take on a set? And what are the physical manifestations in gesture space of those properties and actions? And so this is sort of showing, yeah, you can do union, you can do set difference, you can delete things, you can have subsets, you can have location. And so this, this set is different from that set, or this subset is different from this subset because they're not at the same location. That's this notion of the metaphor that proximity means similarity and distance means dissimilarity. So basically you can combine these metaphors along with this notion of a set and create a very large gesture space just off of sets. And you can, I'll show you two other videos, this one right now, of people doing operations on sets.
Example up in New York with SEIU 1199, coming together with workers and employers, putting a little bit of contribution from each into a trust fund to provide for care for whether it's, elderly or children or whatever, to subsidize that.
So she's doing a lot of things there, but the key thing she's doing is she's constructing the set, she's adding elements, she's also enumerating elements in a set. She's doing lots of different things there. And one of the beauties of doing it this way is that you then have a model of how to animate it, because the animation is now tied to the physical manipulation of the gesture itself. So there can be, you can set up a sort of a blend space of animations. Like there's a small container that's constructed really rapidly, a small container that's constructed slowly, a large container constructed fast, or a large container constructed slow. And just with those four animations, you get a complete gesture space of different kinds of gestures as you move around the space, just by taking into account that the physical properties of the metaphor essentially are tied to, the variations in the animation. Now, okay, so we have these sort of interesting complex metaphors, but that's just the beginning of the issue, right? Because what we saw earlier was we saw two gestures working together, the construction of the set and then removing somebody from it, right? Calbri and Kendon talk about these notions of ideational units or gestural units. And it's this basic idea that it's not about single gestures. It's often about the coupling of related ideas that span multiple gestures. And so you get this sort of, these ideational units that span some sort of common overriding idea or topic. And the gestures are kind of related to each other in this space that's being constructed in gesture space. And so this tends to influence the form of the gestures and how the gestures are co-articulated. In particular, let me show you one of these. This is a gesture where she is crafting a whole scene with her gesture, and she's including a set gesture as well.
Were hearts and minds changed? Was there an available audience to me at the Fox News Channel of Republicans and independents and Democrats who are open-minded, who were there for persuading?
So she set up a whole space. In lots of things going on there. Notice that when she lays out the Democrats, independents, and Republicans, they're along the line, because independents are halfway between, in her model, between Republicans and Democrats, but Democrats and Republicans are far apart, right? And she's sort of taking these subsets of individuals, doing a union over them to create this new set, which she's going to try to have an influence over. And so you see a whole sequence of gestures that are laying out a space in controlling in interesting kinds of ways. Now, within ideational units, within these constructions, no, she never dropped out a gesture space. Her hands did not go down because these things were all connected. And so what Calby argues is essentially when within an ideational unit, gestures tend to share certain features, like they may share hand shape, they may share handiness, location. Any changes in form are supposed to convey specific meaning that gesture is trying to convey. And the hands tend to stay with, there tends to be co-articulation between the gestures. The gestures don't drop out, because dropping out of gesture space is basically a period or an end of a paragraph, right? So she's saying, you know, you're constructing these things all, and you keep your hands in gesture space. Whereas across ideational units, you'll see this demarcative function where there's a change in form or motion, or there's a tendency to drop the hands to a rest position, which is essentially a period or end of paragraph in terms of the gesturing. And you can kind of model this. I'm not going to go through the details of how to model this in terms of creating the animation. Let me just skip over this. And you can actually build systems that do this kind of thing, which is not playing for some reason, which is maybe just as well. What time is it? This thing ends at 5:30, right? Yeah. So let's not go over this. Let me get through a few more of these before I end. Now, okay, so now we have complex gestures, we have gestural sequences. Now we have the added issue of a single gesture can carry multiple meanings. So for instance,
that room gets very unpolite.
So here he's saying that these groups of people are coming together to meet, but the collision here is actually suggesting conflict. So it's people coming together, but there's also a conflict. So he's saying two things. He's also kind of saying it a little bit off the record, right? He doesn't want to, the gesture is conveying information that's in addition to what he's saying. It's not completely distinct because he's saying unpolite, but in fact, he's conveying some information through the gesture that's really not in the speech. And of course, we already saw this. We already saw this gesture.
Is there anything that
Now, normally a frame gesture or a container gesture is something like this. She constructs it like this. And I think she's doing that because she actually wants to argue it's a protected space. That really, the conversation between her and the client, again, she's a clinician, her and the client is in a protected space. So she's saying, yeah, we can talk about anything, but it's a privileged conversation. Oh my God. Okay, let's keep going. And of course, this is all choreographed. It's not just the gesture, right? If you look at what she's doing,
is there anything that
she's doing two other things. She's doing an eyebrow lift in a head lift, which tends to be emphasis. So she's emphasizing with an eyebrow lift. She's doing a head sweep, which Kendon argued basically suggests that it's almost as if she's looking at the possible topics of conversation as if they're physical objects in the real world. So she's doing this head sweep, which is sort of reinforcing the container. So she's like looking at all these things in the real world. But she never moves her eyes from the client. So it's not like she moves, like she's really looking at those objects. Her eyes are fixated on the clients all the times because she really wants to attract and hold the attention of the client. So there's a choreography going on here. And I'm going to skip these.
and wants to be warm and fuzzy, anything you
And I think I'm gonna try and stop here. I'm gonna get through this one. The last thing I want to say is, as I sort of mentioned before, you know, in this is an argument that Kendon makes, and there's, if people are interested, there's a great article in McNeil's edited volume on gesture, where Kendon talks about the fact that gestures carry meaning that are not in the verbal channel. But you get this sort of thing like people are saying, that's a great idea, and you know they'll wave their hand, or they'll go, that's a great idea, like you're crazy or something. And so they're really conveying things in the gesture that are not necessarily in the spoken language. And one of the rationales for doing this is essentially gestures are somewhat more off the record. They tend not to be something that people react to. If you say it out loud like you're crazy, they have to react to. But people may not react to the gesture. And in fact, you can make sure they don't even see the gesture. But so there's this whole game of like, what's on the record that can be commented on and what's off the record. And there's enormous individual cultural differences, which I'm going to skip over.
I used to be in the past.
I will say something about this. So she does this. Oh.
I used to be in the past.
So she does a classic past gesture, right? In the past. Like past is on a line in front of her. The past is over here, the present's here, the future's here. I just want to comment on this because it's important for cultural differences. If you're in France, you'll see people talk about the past like it's behind them and the future's in front of them, because the metaphor is you're walking along the line of time. And then in certain, Kendon points out, in certain Latin American cultures, people talk about the past as if it's in front. So they'll point in front, because the metaphor is seeing is knowing. So I know the past, therefore I can see it. And the future, which I don't know, is now behind me. So it's an absolute reverse of the French gesture. And so basically what we're getting here is there's a lot of information being conveyed through these things. And however I build this box in the middle that goes from the utterance text and the audio, or and if I'm lucky, the cognitions and emotions of the virtual human to that behavior, it has to cover a lot of information. And I don't know, should I stop here? It's like I'm over.
I mean, you can conclude, that's all right. A few more minutes is good.
Let me conclude with just this. So there's a lot of really great work on data-driven machine learning approaches to going from speech to gesture. Taras and Ilva have done great work. LP and I had a student, CC Chu there, that worked on speech to gesture. There's also other, and these are usually a sort of DNN, largely end-to-end approaches. So you get the input, you get the text in the audio maybe as input, and you get the gesture as output. There's also approaches that carve it up into a range of different kinds of ML-based components that analyze separately things like syntactic structure, rhetorical structure, metaphoric structure, and these distinct analyses are then combined in some gesture. And then there's the handcrafted rule-based approaches that Hannes worked on, Beat, and my student Gina Lee worked on NVBG. The interesting thing to think about this is the machine learning automation is the things at the top have the most automation. The number of Stacy supervised PhDs is most of my PhDs, well, all my PhDs getting PhDs in nonverbal behavior. I've worked on machine learning techniques. But in fact, often designers don't use the techniques that, including myself for that matter, have not used the technique because in fact, there's no good way necessarily of enforcing designer intentions. And so what we find is, you get less designer control with the machine learning approaches that my students like Gina did a machine learning approach as well, and CC did there at the top. You get less designer control. And I would argue, I believe that in terms of the number of applications, the work that Beat is still heavily used by, I don't know if Hannes uses it, but Tim Bickmore uses it. And NVBG is still heavily used. And these are the ones because you can really enforce designer intentions. You really can design the thing the way you want it to work, as opposed to some automated approach. And additionally, you have a lot more control over the aesthetics because it's just telling you use this behavior, then some animators coming in and creating that animation exactly the way you want it. It's not some sort of inference from mocap data. So I'm going to skip over this, which is basically looking at this question of should we go beyond realism? And I'll skip over all this.
Take a model with no makeup.
Which is all these nice videos. And I just want to have a few concluding remarks. So my whole point of going through this is really to say, okay, gestures involve all these joints. Their meaning is conveyed in multiple ways across these joints in terms of the hand shapes, the motion, and variations in that realization convey variations in meaning. The relationship between gestures, mental states, and dialogue is very complex. The communicative function of a gesture performance can relate to words, it can relate to phrases, multiple non-contiguous phrases in the dialogue, or become a distinct communicative function. And the question is, do we need such richness, right? To what purpose is our character gesturing? Does the application need realism and richness of meaning? And in the applications I've been involved in, it is often the case that we try to achieve richness, but we don't try to achieve it through things like machine learning. And the caveat to take home is, keep in mind, I'm a psychologist. The psychologist/artist in me is in constant conflict with the engineer. It's like, I want the complexity because I really do like modeling internal mental states. So that doesn't necessarily mean everyone should be doing this. And everyone should not necessarily be thinking in terms of the kinds of realism that I was just talking about. All those slides I jumped over about the alternative to realism is basically making the argument that we can think about moving away from realism in specific kinds of ways. Anyways, but it's very late, so I'll stop there. Sorry for holding you over.
Thank you, Stacey. That was really fun. And yeah, it was great to see that second perspective, which often is second perspective of the psychologist and an artist, as to thinking. So it's I feel it's a very different way of thinking, and I feel it has contributed to at least how I have personally studied this field. So I had a quick question, unless someone else has a question. Okay, so I'll go forward with my question. You talked about multiplicity, and I think that is a very interesting concept, especially because you have this one gesture which could mean two different things in two different contexts, possibly. And I think that's one of the things that is really hard to model as in a data-driven manner, because your output is very probabilistic. So do you think that if we have, is it always is it always supposed to be probabilistic, or is that something we could potentially rectify by seeing? So as a person, if I were to interact with someone, would their behavior still be probabilistic, even if I've interacted with them, like say 100,000 times? as compared to seeing them a few handful of number of times. I don't know if the question makes sense.
Well, I think you learn about people when you interact with them, right? So I think it becomes less probabilistic. I'll say a few things about that. One is that when we actually put these complex gestures in front of people and do studies, what we find is that some people get one interpretation, some people get the other interpretation, and yet a third group gets both interpretations. So you really do get this kind of variation in interpretation. And so the slides I jumped over are really this statement about what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve realism in the encoding, or are you trying to ensure that the observer decodes the message exactly the way you want them to? And it really depends on the application. So for instance, people have built applications for training FBI agents about how to make inferences about whether or not some child's been abused, right? And so there you want to make sure you're using realism because you're training someone to look at realistic behaviors and make accurate inferences. But in other times, you may just care about decoding. You may care and I mentioned this notion of actors. Actors are easy to decode. They use behavior that's easier to decode. And so the question is, what are you really trying to achieve? Decoding or accurate encoding or accurate decoding? And I think it really depends on the application, frankly.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think Maya has a question. She has her.
Hi, Maya.
Hi, I love this talk. I've been fascinated by metaphoric gestures forever. And I just love every part of your talk, Stacy, because it's just so incredibly hard. And one thing I wanted to throw into the mix is also mirroring. So people do mirror one another's expression style in some sense, and even gestures. And I think that makes things even harder, right? So I don't think you touched on that, but I think people don't also have fixed styles, right? And I think this was in the previous question as well, which is that even during a conversation in a dynamic, one person's gesturing style and probably the amount of gesturing can impact another's, which is just like another layer of mess.
Yeah.
Yeah. But separately, I wanted to ask an actual question, which is, okay, so what to do? Like I have a student right now, and we're looking at this very problem, in particular in the context of culturally appropriate gestures, let's say for the educational domain. So what do you say, having been here for a long time, which way to go, and do they come together, right? So data-driven ML, which I can see as kind of the lower hanging fruit, or modeling, which is, wow, wonderful and fascinating and daunting. What do you do for a given context like that?
So I think one thing, the way I would actually proceed if we had the money would be, I would use the modeling to design the space to collect gestures. So in some sense, you really need to make sure that the data you're doing the machine learning on is rich enough. And so the model tells you what kind of data you need what's the context in which you collect the data, essentially. And then the thing is, you're gonna be really careful about the data being collected, that it's good. It's like, you don't want to be in this space of like, there's a lot of, there's a lot of data out there that doesn't have really good hand motion. And that might work if you have a robot that doesn't have fingers, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work for a virtual human. It just doesn't look right. It looks like there's something wrong. They've had some sort of neurological damage. And so, even though, I've done that with my students, I would not ever use it in an application, because I really do want to get, if the virtual human has fingers, they should do finger-like things. I guess is the way to talk about it.
That makes perfect sense. And that gets to the point of embodiment, right? Because if your robot doesn't have that expressive component, can you get away with less? Typically, we don't have fingers in these kinds of things. Like, fingers are super hard. but I'm also, I think I completely agree with you with other kinds of data, but in particular, so, you hear students saying things like, I'll get YouTube data. But when we look at the richness of those data, they just rarely have it. Yeah, like you watch them, you're like, wow, those people don't gesture very much.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And that's why, so some data sets are really focusing on talk show hosts. So the people who gesture a lot, and typically, you have to think about what's your application. So for instance, doing the psychological assessment framework, when LP and I were working on that, we were looking at real clinicians, right? Because this was the role we were trying to create. So it's like, and clinicians gesture, politicians gesture, talk show hosts tend to gesture, but other people don't. And so you may not need the gesture, right? So it really becomes very application specific, frankly. But in the end, I think for me, the thing that I think we need to take into account is, the roboticist who's building a robot is in a design space, right? They're figuring out, what kind of functionality do I need in the robot to achieve certain ends? The virtual human community is basically gets stuck a little bit too much in humanoid realism, right? It's a different kind of thing. It's sort of like, people who are designing a robot have to start off, unless they're Hanson, they're going to start off from the perspective of, hey, these things are hard. What functionality, what joints do I need? What degrees of freedom do I need? And I think that's the right way to think about it, frankly. But it's unclear whether that's consistent across applications. Because, when you see someone like a clinician gesture, you realize everything that clinician is doing is designed to calm the patient and make them feel comfortable. And you really need to pay attention to that, frankly, to get it right. And so to me, it's, this constant conflict. The psychologist side of me wants to do the deep model, and the application side of me wants to say, well, what does the application need, really?
I don't know if I can jump in.
Go, please do. There's only a bunch of us here.
Then I have to go and put them to bed here, but I just want to get in because, and this maybe relates to this last question, but it also relates to what you said earlier about why people are still using Beat and they are not really necessarily using all these more complex models. I think one reason why Beat is kind of like used over and over again, I think the main component of Beat that is producing something that somehow has a good effect on the animation is the connection with the information structure. I mean, the main component of the linguistic analysis of Beat is to find out which part of the sentence should be emphasized based on discourse modeling, based on information structure. Actually, it's very simple. It's mostly looking at lexical newness. Yeah. And that single thing produces a Beat gesture that occurs at a point in time where the speaker wants the listener to pay attention. It's a specific moment in time. If the stroke of the gesture happens exactly when you want the listener to kind of pick up the most information-rich part of what's being said. That has a particular functionality. It has a functionality of clear communication. Many of the more complex machine-learned models that are getting a lot of rich hand movement may actually miss this one point, this single most important point about co-verbal gesture. And when you put them side by side, yes, you might have something that at a glance looks more human and organic coming out of the YouTube learned gesturing, but the Beat model will win in many cases where you just want clarity in picking up the speech, paying attention to the right content. So in my mind, I feel like we have to get the base model correct. We have to get the information structure, the basic communication model of where do you place emphasis. And And then you can build richness on top of those. I feel like if the foundation is not there, no matter how rich your data is, and you get an incredibly organic and personalized type of gesturing, it's kind of not really worth going that way, I think.
Yeah,
If
it
you can
becomes
get the
noise almost. Becomes noise.
so for me, the low-hanging fruit is not the machine learning models. The low-hanging fruit are the simple rules that connect to language.
Yeah, I mean, this similar thing happens in Cerebella, where it actually looks at a rhetorical structure. So, you know, beat looks at rhyme and theme, and in Cerebella uses a slightly different model, but it's a similar kind of thing where you're looking at the structure and noting the structure is what you're really trying to illustrate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you could say, and there's an analog in speech synthesis, when you have voice synthesis that is actually, people are really pushing to get human-like voices. The actual, like the sound of the voice is really human-like. But if they get the pitch accents on the wrong words, you can work as much as you want on the realism of the voice, but if the pitch accents come on the wrong word, the realism of the conversation or the usefulness of the conversation just drops. Like, what kind of a dumb person puts an emphasis on a word that has a very high given value in the conversation? There's no point in paying attention to that word.
But in addition to getting the structure right, in particular getting the rhyme and theme right in beat, I think the fact that the designer has control over essentially what animation is actually going to play at these various points actually has an impact as well.
Yeah, for the iconic and metaphoric, those were kind of libraries. And then the beats and the dictics, they had to be inverse kinematics, and those could lead to weird gestures, really ugly looking gestures.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is like, I want the things to look beautiful. I mean, you know, there's the effect in which may not require beauty, right? But there's a part of me that's just the artist, and I just want it to look great.
You know, I also just want to say that I see this real theme across the three talks, where we're all talking about getting real data in context.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, multimodal, right? So, you know, just as Stacy was saying now, well, it's the hands, but also look what she's doing with her eyes, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, back to that same old story that we need, no matter what we're doing and with how much data, even if we're extracting rules from it, we still have to look at this really messy, multimodal, in context, time sensitive thing. So it's never a dull moment for any of us, right?
But, you know, we do it because there's something very special when the thing moves.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. And when things move in synchrony,
Yeah.
you know, that's the most beautiful moment, when all of things come together, and it's like an orchestra, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. This is really cool. I think thank you to all of you spending your Saturday with us. And I think in the 5 hours, I think I have seen all the different angles I could have ever imagined, and I'm sure all the other participants felt the same. So thank you for these wonderful talks, and thank you for spending your time with us.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you all. I enjoyed all discussions and all talks. So I knew it was going to be fun, but it's even more fun hearing all the discussions also after the talks. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Chaitanya, for organizing this workshop with the help of Don. That was great.
Thank you. Great job. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for bringing us together.
Yeah, it was definitely fun. Yeah. It's great seeing you all kind of remotely.
Yeah, same here. Stay well. Let's do this again.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.